Let's jump right in. Welcome to this explainer. Have you ever watched a piece of digital art and just felt an undeniable, almost magnetic connection to it? Like it actually has its own heartbeat? Well, today we are unpacking exactly how that magic happens. We're exploring the fascinating art and science of making digital creations feel genuinely alive. We're going to trace this awesome journey of animation, looking at how the timeless principles, developed by early pioneers on paper, collided head-on with modern computer graphics, totally changing the way we interact with digital media today. So to really get into this, we have to ask the core question, the one that bridges the massive gap between cold, hard code and living, breathing art. Why do some computer animations feel completely alive, while others literally just look like moving math? I mean, if you look back at early computer-generated imagery, a lot of it was incredibly impressive technically, but it felt strangely hollow, kind of rigid, just lifeless. So today, we are going to figure out the exact missing ingredient that finally transformed static pixels into characters and interfaces with genuine personality. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with the illusion of life, move into the 12 animation principles, see about bringing principles to 3D, talk about bridging the software gap, and finally wrap up with the future of animation. Let's get to it. Part 1. The illusion of life, tracing the magic of motion. This whole desire to create motion, it is absolutely not a new obsession. As early as the 17th century, people were literally using magic lanterns, which were basically these super early slide projectors, to create these eerie horror shows called phantasmagoria. That laid the absolute groundwork for a visual culture. Then zoom ahead to the 1930s, and studios like Disney were refining all of this into a true art form, with 2D, hand-drawn principles. The 1980s, that hit us with the massive revolution of 3D computer graphics. And today, we're seeing the wild integration of generative AI and advanced motion UI. But across all these centuries, the main goal has remained exactly the same: to completely captivate the human eye. And despite all those massive technological leaps, the fundamental definition actually hasn't changed at all. It's just creating the illusion of motion through a sequence of images displayed really rapidly. That's it. Whether you're storyboarding a simple little 2D cartoon, or you're rendering an intensely glowing dynamic 3D brain scan showing neural pathways with a sleek, dark medical sci-fi aesthetic, and dynamic camera rotation to educate a patient, the entire objective relies entirely on how our brains process these rapid images. Every great piece of animated content still relies on meticulous storyboarding to map out that visual narrative, frame by tiny frame. All right, moving to part 2, the 12 animation principles. Basically, the rules of creating life. Now, instead of getting totally overwhelmed by all 12 of the original principles detailed in Thomas and Johnston's famous book, The Illusion of Life, because honestly, that is just way too much to memorize, we can clearly categorize them into 3 super useful buckets. Think of them as geometric, temporal, and communication tools. So geometric manipulation includes things like squash and stretch, which we're going to talk a lot about, as well as arcs and follow-through. Temporal controls, well, those are all about time, right? Timing and slow in and slow out. And finally, clarity and communication. That relies on staging and exaggeration to make sure you, the audience, immediately grasp the emotion of the action. These weren't just made-up rules. They were absolutely essential techniques developed to exaggerate the real physical world, turning hand-drawn art into a highly sophisticated medium. Just look at the basic 2D bouncing balls squashing and stretching on the left there. It perfectly shows physical weight. When it hits the ground, boom, it flattens out, distributing its volume. And as it bounces back up, it stretches. Honestly, it's the most basic test for any beginner animator trying to learn physical weight. Now, look right next to it. Notice how animation legend John Lasseter famously applied this exact same principle to a digital 3D character, Loxo Jr. By treating a digital hinged 3D object the exact same way a traditional animator treats a bouncing ball or a sack of flour, the animation instantly transcends basic geometry. The character literally starts to breathe. Which brings us perfectly to part 3, bringing principles to 3D, the Loxo Jr. revolution. See, the industry hit a massive roadblock early on. Early 3D systems were built almost entirely by scientists and mathematicians, which meant the output was incredibly technically accurate, computing exact vectors and splines. But artistically, it was totally dead. The creators of this early software were heavily focused on physics, which meant they completely ignored about 70 years of artistic evolution that traditional animators had already figured out. The result? Well, you got characters that moved like rigid, unfeeling robots. No soul whatsoever. But John Lasseter found a completely brilliant solution to this exact problem. If you look closely at Luxo Jr., Lasseter realized that squash and stretch actually defines the rigidity of the material making up an object. Like if you squash a metal lamp, it shouldn't just fold up like a soft pillow, right? So Lasseter made the base of the lamp completely rigid, while the hinges and the rest of the body squash and stretch around it. By combining those rigid parts with flexible movement, he instantly gave this digital object a sense of real-world physical weight and a deeply lifelike personality. It was an absolute game changer. Lasseter proved, once and for all, that applying these classic rules was absolutely essential to creating high-quality computer animation. Let's look at 4 of the heavy hitters he utilized. First, timing. This dictates weight and emotion. A heavy object simply needs more frames to start and stop moving than a light one does. Second, anticipation. Before a character jumps, they have to crouch, right? This directs the audience's eye, so you know exactly what's about to happen. Third is staging, making sure an action is unmistakably clear, often ensuring the character's silhouette reads perfectly even without any internal details. And finally, follow through. When a character stops moving, loose parts, like their arms or a lamp cord, should actually continue moving past the termination point before finally settling. These rules literally trick our brains into believing the digital weight is real. All right, part 4. Bridging the software gap. Scientists versus artists. This quote from animator Joseph Gilland absolutely hits the nail on the head regarding the frustration of that era. He noted that the academic language of physics had completely taken over the software interfaces. There was this massive disconnect between the two disciplines, mostly because the software developers had no idea about the rich, emotional language animators had been speaking for decades. Just imagine trying to paint a beautiful masterpiece, but your paintbrush only understands complex algebra. It just doesn't work. You can really see the stark contrast right here. On one side, you have the language of scientific software, splines, vectors, kinematics, continuous continuity. And on the other side, the language of the artist, squash, stretch, appeal, anticipation. You can see exactly why traditional animators found it so incredibly frustrating to use early computer software. They're sitting there trying to inject emotion, humor, and physical weight into a scene, but the software is asking them to adjust a mathematical tension spline. It totally hindered rapid experimentation, which, let's be real, is exactly how artists learn and master their craft. Thankfully, modern developers finally fix this by creating what we call motion amplifiers. Instead of a dense, terrifying spreadsheet of numbers, the user interface now features friendly visual icons that map directly to those classic principles of animation we talked about. We've got an icon for squash and stretch, one for anticipation, one for slow in and slow out. By building interfaces that actually speak the artist's own language, developers successfully ditched all that complex physics math. It finally allowed creators to focus entirely on the actual performance of their digital characters. And using these tools, it's incredibly intuitive, breaking down the barrier to entry for pretty much everyone. Step 1, you just sketch an object or character right on the screen. Step 2, you grab the object with your mouse or stylus and drag it to record a motion path. Direct manipulation, super easy. And step 3, you just click to apply the semantic amplifiers. You want it to look heavier? Just click the squash and stretch amplifier. You want it to snap to a stop? Tweak the slow in and slow out amplifier. The software handles all the crazy complex math of preserving the object's value and deforming its shape completely in the background. Let's look at that workflow in action. A user draws this simple, charming little 2D bird. They draw a lasso around it to define the object. Then, by literally just dragging the bird up and down physically, they record its flight path. Finally, they apply the squash and stretch and the slow in and out amplifiers. And boom, the software automatically calculates exactly how the bird's body should elongate as it speeds up and how it should squash down as it slows down. Suddenly, this rigid, static sketch completely transforms into a dynamic, living character. And the best part? The user never had to look at a single mathematical spline. Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, the future of animation, amplifiers, and AI. What we are witnessing right now is just this incredible collaboration between human creativity and immense algorithmic power. Because these tools have become so incredibly intuitive, dynamic, organic, motion is no longer restricted to just high-end feature film studios. It is accessible to everyone. Whether it's a corporate explainer video using crisp vector animations, a new software interface using subtle motion to guide your eye, or even generating a ridiculously detailed, intensely illuminated 3D brain scan dynamically rotating on a glowing dark backdrop for a cutting-edge medical presentation, algorithms are finally learning to play on the artist's team. They are doing all the heavy mathematical lifting so that us humans can focus strictly on the storytelling and the emotion. And that leaves us with a really fascinating thought to take away from all this. We have spent centuries trying to perfect the illusion of life, and decades trying to get computers to understand how to do it with actual soul and appeal. But now that the software finally understands the 100-year-old language of the artist, those technical barriers are rapidly, completely disappearing. The tools are literally right there at our fingertips, more intuitive than ever before. So the only limit to animation today is your own imagination. As software finally learns the language of the artist, what new illusions of life will you create? Thanks for joining me on This Explainer, and keep creating out there.